Have you ever wondered what actually causes a country's currency to collapse? Most people jump straight to one answer. The government just printed too much money. But what if I told you that's only a small part of a much bigger, more fascinating story? The real reason is often far deeper and more complex. It's not just about the printing press. It's about something called state credibility. Think of it like this. A currency is basically an IOU from the government. You accept it because you trust that the government will honor its value and that others will accept it from you. This trust is built on the government's ability to manage its finances, collect taxes, and maintain a stable economy. This is its fiscal capacity. When that trust erodes, when people start doubting the government's ability to back its own promises, the whole system begins to crumble. Let's travel back in time to 16th century Spain for a perfect example. Spain was, at the time, the wealthiest and most powerful empire in the world. They had mountains of silver pouring in from their colonies in the Americas. It was like they had won the lottery every single year, so if anyone had enough real money, it was them. But here's the twist. Despite all that silver, the Spanish Empire went bankrupt. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. How could this happen? Well, the Spanish crown was constantly at war. These wars were incredibly expensive. They spent far more than even their vast silver income could cover. To fund these endless conflicts, they borrowed heavily from bankers all over Europe. The silver from the New World would arrive in Seville, and almost immediately it was paid out to these foreign creditors. The money didn't even have a chance to circulate within Spain's own economy. The Spanish government essentially mortgaged its future. They promised future silver shipments to pay off current debts. As the debts piled up and the wars dragged on, their creditors started to get nervous. They began to doubt if Spain could ever truly pay them back. The government's credibility was shot. Eventually, the king would just declare bankruptcy, telling his lenders, "Sorry, can't pay you right now." This shattered trust in the Spanish state. If the king wouldn't honor his debts to powerful international bankers, what did that mean for the value of the currency used by everyday people? It meant that the money in their pockets was backed by a government that couldn't be trusted. Confidence evaporated. This is the core of a currency collapse. Not the printing of paper, but the destruction of faith in the state's ability to manage its affairs. This isn't just ancient history. We see echoes of this today. When a government consistently spends more than it earns, relies too heavily on borrowing, and fails to build a productive domestic economy, it's walking the same dangerous path as 16th century Spain. The overprinting of money is often a desperate last resort, a symptom of a much deeper disease, a complete loss of fiscal capacity and state credibility. So, the next time you hear about a currency in crisis, look beyond the headlines about money printing. Ask the real questions. Can the government pay its debts? Is its economy productive? And most importantly, do people still trust its promises? Because in the end, money is all about trust. Once that's gone, no amount of silver or gold can save it. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into how our world really works. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what really causes a country's economy to collapse? We often hear about things like printing too much money or massive government debt. But what if the real problem is something deeper, something about trust? Let's dive into the history of 3 major economic meltdowns to see what they can teach us. First, let's go back to Britain after World War I. The country was drowning in debt. The big debate was whether to return to the gold standard, which would mean paying back that debt at its pre-war value. This would be incredibly painful, requiring high taxes and deep spending cuts. The alternative was to devalue the currency, essentially a soft default on their obligations. Britain chose the hard path. Why? Because the political elite, the bankers, and the industrialists all agreed that the nation's credibility was on the line. They believed that honoring their debts, no matter the cost, was essential for the future of the British Empire as a global financial center. They paid a heavy price in the short term, but they preserved their financial reputation. Now, let's contrast that with Weimar Germany. After the war, Germany was in a completely different political situation. The old empire had collapsed, and the new republic was fragile, facing threats from both the far left and the far right. The government was weak and deeply divided. When faced with massive war reparations and a shattered economy, there was no political consensus on how to handle it. Powerful industrial groups wanted inflation to wipe out their domestic debts, while workers and the middle class were terrified of losing their savings. The government, caught in the middle and fearing a political breakdown, couldn't make the tough choices. So they just kept printing money. The result was hyperinflation, one of the most catastrophic economic disasters in modern history. The German mark became worthless, not just because of the printing press, but because the government behind it had lost all credibility. Finally, let's look at Argentina. For decades, Argentina has been stuck in a cycle of boom and bust, debt and default. It's a country rich in resources, but it can't seem to achieve lasting stability. A key reason is the deep, persistent political polarization. Different factions, from populists to free market reformers, have completely opposite ideas about how the economy should be run. When one group is in power, they implement their policies only to have them completely reversed when the opposition takes over. This constant policy whiplash means no one, not investors, not businesses, and not ordinary citizens, can trust that the economic rules will be the same tomorrow. This lack of political credibility makes it impossible to build a stable monetary system. Every crisis is met with short-term fixes that just sow the seeds for the next one. So, what's the common thread? Britain, Weimar Germany, and Argentina show us that a stable currency isn't just about economic formulas. It's built on a foundation of political credibility. When a country's leadership is united and seen as trustworthy, it can navigate even the worst financial storms. But when the political system is fractured and trust evaporates, even a sound economy can spiral into chaos. It's a powerful lesson from history that is more relevant than ever today. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history and economics. See you next time. Currencies are political instruments. Currencies are not just economic tools. They are political instruments. They represent a living relationship between the state and its population, an implicit agreement that taxes will be collected, contracts enforced, debts honored, and order maintained. When that relationship fractures, money becomes unstable. When it breaks entirely, collapse follows. This is why focusing solely on money printing is intellectually shallow. Central banks expand their balance sheets for many reasons: crisis management, war financing, recession response. Printing can coexist with complete stability as long as the underlying political structure remains credible. Japan is the proof. Japan has run debt levels above 250% of GDP for years. Its central bank has engaged in massive, sustained asset purchases. By the logic of most inflation alarmists, Japan should have collapsed long ago. It has not. Why? Because Japan maintains deep domestic savings, institutional continuity, and powerful social cohesion. The tax base functions. The political system, while imperfect, retains legitimacy. The debt is held overwhelmingly by domestic institutions and citizens. The structure holds. Stability is not about optics. It is about cohesion. The real structural conditions for monetary collapse is rare, not because governments are disciplined angels, but because most states understand that their own survival requires adaptation. They inflate gradually rather than catastrophically. They restructure debt before it becomes unmanageable. They impose capital controls when necessary. They negotiate. They shift policy frameworks. They bend rules rather than shatter entire systems. Collapse is failure. Inflation is negotiation. So what are the actual structural conditions under which monetary systems genuinely fail? First, the tax base erodes. When productive capacity shrinks or escapes the state's reach entirely. When economic activity moves underground or offshore. If a government cannot extract revenue from its own population, it cannot sustain its obligations. Full stop. Second, political cohesion fractures. When factions refuse all compromise, when citizens reject shared sacrifice. Monetary stability requires collective belief in a common future. Without that belief, coordination collapses entirely. Third, external liabilities exceed internal legitimacy. Foreign currency debt is particularly lethal. If a state owes money in a currency it cannot print, it becomes completely dependent on external confidence. The moment that confidence wavers, vulnerability multiplies at terrifying speed. Fourth, credibility evaporates. When people genuinely expect tomorrow to be worse than today and begin acting on that expectation. Confidence collapse always precedes price collapse. The moment citizens rush to convert local currency into hard goods, gold, or foreign assets, the spiral has already begun. Money is not valuable because it is printed. It is valuable because it is trusted. And trust is entirely political. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, sovereign debt levels have climbed steadily across every developed economy. After 2020, they exploded. Trillions were created almost overnight to stabilize markets, fund stimulus, and prevent economic collapse during the pandemic. Central bank balance sheets expanded at speeds that would have been considered unthinkable just one generation earlier. Inflation surged in 2021 and 2022 to levels not seen in decades. From the outside, it looked exactly like the opening scene of every monetary collapse story ever told. And yet, no systemic currency death spiral followed. The US dollar did not disintegrate. The euro did not evaporate. Japan did not implode. Bond markets strained. Currencies fluctuated. But the system held. Why? Because printing alone does not determine survival. Structure does. The United States, for all its deep political polarization, maintains one of the broadest and most productive tax bases on the planet. It borrows overwhelmingly in its own currency. Its treasury market remains the deepest and most liquid financial market in human history. Global trade is still largely denominated in dollars. Its institutions, however heavily criticized, continue to function. That does not make it immune to inflation. It does not mean it cannot make catastrophic financial mistakes. But it does mean the core pillars, taxation capacity, domestic debt markets, enforcement power, and institutional continuity remain intact. Contrast that with genuine collapse cases. When Lebanon's currency imploded in 2019, it was not simply because of money printing. It was the result of decades of fiscal mismanagement, a rigid dollar peg, massive foreign currency liabilities, endemic corruption, and a banking system built entirely on continuous inflows of external capital. When those inflows stopped, the illusion shattered instantly. The state could not tax enough. It could not borrow externally at any sustainable rate. Political trust had already been reduced to almost nothing. The currency followed the fracture. When Venezuela's bolivar spiraled into hyperinflation through the 2010s, the visible cause was monetary expansion. But underneath was a collapsing oil sector, shrinking production, external sanctions, total fiscal dependency on a single commodity, and the complete breakdown of institutional governance. The tax base withered away. Productive capacity shrank to a fraction of its former level. Political legitimacy fractured beyond repair. Printing filled the gap, but it absolutely did not create the gap. The pattern is always consistent. Collapse requires multiple failures aligned simultaneously. This is precisely why developed economies rarely experience total monetary breakdown. They experience something else entirely: inflation, slow erosion, debt restructuring, financial repression. These are painful, but they are manageable within functioning political systems. Inflation redistributes wealth. It quietly reduces the real value of debt. It pressures savers. It rewards debtors. It shifts purchasing power in ways that are often invisible to the average person. But it does not necessarily destroy the currency. Inflation is often the political compromise, chosen when austerity is politically impossible, and outright default is unacceptable. It is the system absorbing stress, bending rather than breaking. What would actually break a major developed system? Now ask the genuinely hard question. What would it actually take for a major developed monetary system to break completely? It would require a severe erosion of the tax base, not just slower growth, but widespread inability or outright refusal to pay. It would require political fragmentation so deep and so entrenched that fiscal coordination becomes permanently impossible. It would likely require significant exposure to foreign currency debt that simply cannot be serviced, and it would require a visible, undeniable collapse of institutional credibility, courts ignored, contracts unenforced, laws inconsistently applied across factions. Notice what is conspicuously absent from that list: the size of the central bank's balance sheet. Balance sheets can expand and contract. Interest rates can rise and fall. Debt to GDP ratios can climb for decades if growth, taxation, and credibility keep pace. Japan has demonstrated this with remarkable consistency since the 1990s. Stagnant growth, aging demographics, enormous and growing public debt, years of quantitative easing. And yet the system has not collapsed because the debt is primarily domestically held. The political system remains cohesive enough, and institutions have maintained sufficient legitimacy. Money is not a commodity. It is an agreement. The moment that agreement dissolves, collapse accelerates. Until then, even deeply and obviously flawed systems can endure far longer than anyone predicts. Risk is real, but risk is structural. This does not mean risk is imaginary. It means risk is structural, and structural risk builds quietly long before it becomes visible. Political polarization in major economies is rising with measurable consistency. Trust in institutions has declined across most countries over the past 2 decades. Demographic shifts are placing enormous strain on pension systems that were never designed for aging populations. Geopolitical fragmentation is actively challenging global trade flows that the entire modern financial system depends on. Sovereign debt burdens are at historically high levels by almost every measure. These are real pressures. Every single one of them. But pressure is not fracture. The difference between strain and collapse lies in one critical question. Can institutions still adapt? Can governments reform tax systems before they fail? Can they restructure debt without triggering the panic they are trying to prevent? Can they maintain the rule of law when it becomes politically inconvenient? Can they coordinate across deeply hostile political factions when genuine necessity demands it? History suggests, with remarkable consistency, that most systems choose adaptation over destruction. They inflate moderately. They negotiate. They change leadership at critical moments. They revise fiscal rules. They alter monetary frameworks. They stretch the fabric of the system to its absolute limits, rather than tear it entirely. Collapse is rare because the elites who govern these systems understand with crystal clarity what total collapse would actually cost them. Self-preservation is an extraordinarily powerful stabilizer. The question that actually matters, this is where the conversation must shift, from fear to clarity. When someone tells you the system is doomed because they're printing, they are focusing on the instrument. They are ignoring the foundation entirely. The real question is never about the size of a balance sheet. The real question is always, can the political core still command obedience and extract revenue? Do courts still enforce contracts? Is the debt denominated in domestic currency? Are citizens, despite their frustration and anger, still operating within the same shared institutional framework? A currency backed by a functioning state can survive enormous imbalances that would destroy a weaker system overnight. A currency backed by a fractured state cannot survive even moderate stress. That is the uncomfortable truth that most financial commentary refuses to confront. What this means for your money and power have always been inseparable. The strength of any monetary system is a direct reflection of the strength of the political order behind it. Economic bubbles form when credit expands faster than productive capacity. Financial mistakes happen when incentives distort risk perception. Inflation emerges when fiscal and monetary policies stretch beyond sustainable limits. But total monetary breakdown, the kind that wipes out a currency entirely and permanently, requires political disintegration, and that is precisely why most systems do not break. They may weaken, they may inflate, they may steadily erode purchasing power over years and decades. Savers may suffer significant losses in real terms. Asset prices may distort in ways that create deep inequities. But complete collapse demands a level of institutional failure that advanced economies have historically proven extremely reluctant to tolerate. Understanding this changes everything about how you should see financial risk. It shifts your attention from headlines to structure, from central bank announcements to tax capacity, from noise to cohesion, from fear to precision. If you want to genuinely protect your wealth and build something lasting, you do not just monitor inflation rates. You monitor political stability. You watch debt composition, domestic versus foreign held. You observe whether institutions still function under real stress. You pay close attention to whether meaningful reform is possible or whether pure paralysis dominates the political system. Financial freedom is not about predicting apocalypse. It is about understanding systems deeply enough to avoid reacting to shallow, fear-driven narratives. The final truth, history does not repeat exactly, but it leaves fingerprints. And those fingerprints are always structural. Monetary systems actually break when trust evaporates, when fiscal authority collapses entirely, when external obligations overwhelm internal strength beyond any point of recovery, when political cohesion shatters beyond repair, not when a balance sheet expands, not when a headline screams, not when inflation ticks higher for a year or two. History does not punish printing presses. History punishes fractured states. And as long as states can tax, coordinate, and command legitimacy, their currencies, however strained, however imperfect, however burdened, tend to survive. That does not mean complacency is wise. It means precision is necessary. The next time you hear someone declare that this is the end because they are printing, ask the only question that has ever actually mattered. Has the political core actually broken? Because if it has not, what you are witnessing is not collapse. It is negotiation. And negotiation, unlike collapse, has a way of finding its outcome.